Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's topic for research methods. This week I'm going to focus in on research outputs, the research outputs that you're interested in particular, that is theses and exegesis and creative work, and in particular the written components of those rather than the creative aspect of it, which I know very little about. So let's get cracking on this one. I guess there's some shorthand that I probably should explain. Today I may use the word thesis a bit, and I'm really going to be using thesis as a shorthand for not saying all the time thesis or creative work and exegesis. Because in some respects, both of the thesis and a combination of creative work and exegesis do a very similar thing. And that is that, in the broadest definition, they lay down a proposition supported by some type of argument. So in that sense, you know, the thesis and exegesis and creative work are products that do those things. And I just wanted to note the musical derivation of thesis, that idea of a beat, that laying down of the foot, 1, 2, 3, 4, not the offbeat, which is the antithesis, but the thesis being that laying down of a beat. And we can sort of see in that way, you know, an argument or a proposition that continues as a thread throughout a thesis, perhaps in answer to a research question or as a response to a research problem, is like the beat that keeps on keeping on, that guides you through. Just as a research question or a research problem can guide your research investigation, so the answer to that, what it is you want to say about that thing, is what will guide or provide a thread through a whole thesis or exegesis. So in terms of honours outputs and also postgraduate research outputs, so again, if I say honours, I'm thinking about masters and PhD as well. Clearly they're different, but as most people in this unit are doing honours, I'll sort of keep on there, but please don't feel excluded, PhD and masters people. So as an output, this is a document. A dissertation is another word for this document that reflects the end product of your research. We can think of it as a research report, but it's more than just a report. This is a contribution to knowledge, and in that way it's a special type of report on your research. As we've already discussed, it's both a creative product and or body of work plus an exegesis. So it can take that form, or it can take a thesis. And one of the things that's different to work that you've done as an undergraduate student is that this is, for one time, and maybe not the only time, but one time where you are not writing something in answer to somebody else's question. You're posing the question. You're proposing a problem of some type, whether it's a theoretical, empirical, or a creative issue, and also developing an answer to that, developing some type of proposition, some argument, some solution to that. And so your thesis, your exegesis, will not only contain the argument as such, it will also contain the question, and the question as contextualized by, for example, a literature review, or in the context of a problem from the world of practice, the world of politics, the world around us. The primary readers for your work are going to be examiners. Clearly you don't necessarily just write it for them, but they're going to be your primary readers. They're the people who are going to judge this work in the end, and so it's worth keeping them in mind as you're writing. that's who you're writing for. But nevertheless, as examiners, while they might be experts in the field, you're also writing, I guess, for, I think, a audience that is well informed, but not necessarily expert in your field. In terms of your particular problem, you're the one who has the knowledge around that. So how you explain your problem, as well as how you explain your solution to that problem, are key things to be able to articulate clearly for a sort of a general and informed audience, as I say. The details of how of word length, layouts and other requirements for exegeses or theses are set out in the Honours Handbook for those who are doing postgraduate study. Similarly, there will be guidelines for producing these documents. So make sure you're familiar with those and have a sense of what's required before you start. One thing I haven't noted here, which I should have, is that in terms of judging your work, there are criteria for that, and you'll find those in those documents. Again, for honours students, it's going to the criteria for marking your thesis can be found in the third part 3 of 3 thesis or research units, honours research units. So that'll be in CAR 83003. Have I put in enough zeros there? Not sure, but you know what I mean. So have a look at the end information guide, and that will show the examination requirements for your work, both if you're doing creative work as well as if you're doing a traditional style thesis. Some people in creative writing will be doing perhaps a different type of thesis, a fictocritical thesis. This is another style of thesis that sort of, I guess, is combining both creative work and theoretical work rather than keeping them separate. It's a challenging form, so if you've done some of this before, then I think that's probably the best approach. But still, if you want to experiment with this, I think I'd discuss it with your supervisor. There's no formula. One of the things I say about fictocritical theses is that each time they're reinvented as the author writes. So there are models around clearly, but I just wanted to mention that form. Briefly, I'm not going to cover it in detail today. A traditional thesis, so we're just coming back to, I guess, that traditional type of thesis that is known throughout the world in universities. It comes from a scientific model, and you can see this in the structure. But a typical thesis is structured in this way. There's a title page. At some point, there'll be a declaration of originality. That is something that you've signed to say, yep, this is my own work. It hasn't been submitted elsewhere for another assignment or another degree, that type of thing. There'll be an abstract that is that brief overview of the thesis that sort of outlines the context for your thesis, maybe the question, your methods, how you've approached answering that question, your argument, your findings. So that type of thing goes in the abstract. It's what signals to the marker, to your reader, what's coming. The abstract is also often sent to your examiners in order to see whether they're interested in marking your thesis. So in that way, it's a bit like a calling card as well. So it's used in a number of ways. There'll be some acknowledgements that you might want to give to all the people who have helped you along the way, table of contents, and then the main body of the thesis. The main body of the thesis is what is included in the word count. So that's one thing to note. It'll sort of has this typical structure, an introduction that outlines the topic, the rationale for your research, the key terms that you might be using, an overview of the argument, and a structure of the thesis to come. So it can be a very formulaic thing, and I guess in terms of outlining this traditional thesis structure, that's what I'm doing, is just sort of giving that formula for a standard thesis. So that this introduction, I guess, sets your examiner up to understand what you're about, where this has come from, and where we're going to next. And that type of pattern is what you would do throughout your thesis, remembering that you can almost treat each section or each chapter as an essay, and as with any essay, it has an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. And in the introduction, you are doing that setting up work, might just be a paragraph. The body does what you're saying you're going to do in the introduction, and then the conclusion both concludes what you've said and then links on to the next thing, which is the next chapter. Similarly, the introduction might refer back to the previous chapter if that's relevant. And so throughout that process of writing, you're signalling and signposting what's happening to your reader, remembering that this is a long document, longer than an essay, and so therefore you need to provide signposts to keep your reader informed about where you're going. So once you've done the intro, I guess the next thing is the literature review, which then is answering that question of what do we already know about this problem or issue around practice, or in answer to the question, the research question. So what's already known. It then contextualizes your research in that way in terms of what's already existing in the literature. And out of that, I guess what you're doing is positioning your research within current knowledge. Next, there's a methodology section. So this talks about how you're going to go about answering your research question or addressing the problem. Sometimes there may be something from the literature review which indicates a methodology also, either because it's a standard way of doing something for the type of problem that you're interested in, or others may not have used the method that you've used before, and so therefore that could be something new about what you're doing. So the methodology, all that stuff that we've talked about, that this unit's basically on about all the time, that's where all this material goes. The middle chapters then, I guess, outline what you have come up with, having followed through with your method, the middle chapters. So typically these chapters have something like a results chapter, an analysis chapter, and some discussion of the analysis. Now, how this could be separated into 3 sections, it could be just kept as one. And then the conclusion sort of, I guess, wraps the whole thing up. So I guess it will once again outline the question that you started with and reinforce the argument that you're making in relation to the question that you've developed through the middle chapters. So sometimes people have a combined discussion and conclusion. Usually it's a separate chapter, quite a short chapter often, because it's doing that reinforcing work, and it's not coming up with anything new, just as a conclusion of an essay generally doesn't have anything new in it. It's just reiterating what's gone before. So that's the standard model. Introduction, outlining sort of the question and contextualizing it. A literature review which says what's already known about the question. The specific methodology that you're going to use, the how am I going to answer this question. The middle chapters which say what have I come up with in going through my methodology, and a conclusion saying, sort of reinforcing what we've already found. Standard sort of research account, if you like. And all that's in the word count. And then it finishes off with bibliography and appendices. Appendices can include all sorts of things, ethics documents, detailed results that you don't want to include in the main body, images, if you're a creative practitioner in particular, but all of us might have images you want to put in. Of course, it doesn't stop you putting images in the thesis itself, but yeah, I guess appendices can be used to, I guess, reduce your word count. So if there's large discussion around details of your research that you want to include as an appendix rather than in the main body, put them there. And also to have supplementary material that might be of interest to an examiner, such as an ethics application. What you're doing, though, in putting things in appendices is signalling that they're not core to your argument as such and don't need to be read. These are optional extras. So just remember that in making a decision about whether something should go in an appendix or not. They can be hard decisions to make because we're often attached to so much of our material. Before moving away from the traditional thesis, I would like to mention that the form of your thesis can be different to this. Now, in some fields of research, this is an accepted practice to move away from a traditional form. In other fields of research, it's not so traditional. So if in the social sciences, they tend to be it tends to fairly well follow this type of model. If you're in media studies, cultural studies, history, other forms of the humanities, you may well be able to break away from that type of thing, and so some of these aspects of the thesis in the main body can be blended. In particular, sort of blending literature review, methodology, results analysis, discussion. So sometimes you may, in fact, have a series of 2 or 3 chapters which do all of that in one, because you're taking a particular approach to a problem or question, sort of taking a lens, if you like, using a lens on that particular problem that you're going to, or hang on, a better metaphor, a window. It's like you might have 3 different windows to look through onto the same issue. So, so just bearing in mind that there are different models around. The best thing to do, really, in all of this, as a way of demystifying the whole thesis thing, is to find a few and have a look at them and see what previous students have done. And you'll find that there are a range of approaches, and over time, you will develop an outline that probably best suits your work. Okay, so I just want to move now on to exegesis, and well, gee, there's a range of issues to think about here. I'll just start by saying that the root of the word exegesis is sort of to lead someone out, to lead through something, to, I guess, take someone on a bit of a journey. The word comes down, especially through biblical scholarship, and that is that sort of exegesis, exegetical work, which is done on a verse of the Bible to explain the many meanings, the context for the verse, the tradition around the verse, the interpretations that have been given over time. all that type of exegetical work. And so I guess that in some way is what you're doing with an exegesis if you're doing also developing a creative output. So it's part of a creative thesis, thinking about thesis in that terms, or it's so it's a critical explanation or interpretation of a creative product or text. It demonstrates the research and analysis that you've undertaken to contextualize that creative product. It's not necessarily an explanation of the creative product, because often you want to leave that up to the reader to explain it, but you're certainly contextualizing and analysing that work and the process to develop it. It's tied closely to the produced work, so you're producing an integrated package. How exactly you do that integration is open to both you and debate more generally. So that it's working, I guess, as we've discussed early on, it's thinking about the research in your creative practice. So creative practice as research. So you're demonstrating your scholarly method around creative practice. In the reading this week from Malek and Shiloh on exegesis, what is an exegesis? They talk about three different models of exegesis. They talk about a context model, that is an exegesis which provides historical, social or disciplinary context for the work. And they point out some of the shortcomings of that method. That is, it may not discuss creative process, relationship between all those things and the work, but just contextualizing the work. So then they also then go on to talk about the commentary model. That is the way in which your creative work is also a story of research. What you've aimed to do, what the methods are that you've used, and what you've achieved through that. So thinking about it in those terms, they sort of propose that the commentary model is a much stronger model than the context model alone. And I think one of the things to think about here is whether each of these is a clearly defined category in any case, and whether the commentary model would also include some of the context model in it, and I think that's clearly a yes. They also then propose what they think is a more superior model, and that's the research question model. In this, I guess, what is linking both the creative work and the exegesis is the research question or problem. That these two things, this creative work and the exegesis, are two approaches to answering a research problem in different ways. So there's a number of models to think about there as you're contemplating how to write. One will be more maybe comfortable for you than others, different. And I guess I think about this as a bit of a recipe. You've got some ingredients here to play with. How are you going to mix those ingredients? It's an issue for both you and your supervisor to be thinking through around this. To unpack those things a little bit more, and in particular, I guess, the thinking about that commentary model and the research question model, is to also think about what happens in an exegesis. And I've got this from Dr. Jim Hearn, who's produced a document which I will also put online about the exegesis, and he outlines how an exegesis is a document that's written in the first person and comprises four modes of analysis that aren't necessarily held separately but are often integrated. Critical analysis. This is engagement through your keywords with the literature. So this is theoretical work. This is the scholarly theoretical work. Textual analysis is another aspect of this, of the exegesis. How the ideas from the literature through your keywords inform your work. Some comparative analysis, how your work connects with your field of creative practice. So contextualizing your work in that way, so you can sort of see some of those aspects of the models of Milo and Shiloh, and I've got it all wrong there. Anyway, those guys before, and I need to get it right. Milek and Shiloh. My apologies, and then finally analysis of your creative process. So this may be the least emphasized part, but all of these aspects will be part of your exegesis. So this is thinking now about how to approach or what to do in your exegesis, what you might be thinking about in terms of both critical analysis, textual analysis, comparative analysis, and analysis of your process. So I guess comparative analysis more about outputs, creative process, analysis of creative process, more about your process. There are many exegesis structures which flow from these ideas, both in terms of the model of exegesis and the content, those different forms of analysis. And I think I'm going to go through a range of models, but in the end, I think this is something for you to develop for your own work and in consultation with your supervisor. So there's some typical things, however, title pages and so on that we've talked about before in the traditional thesis, an introduction, then a relationship of concepts, content, form and materials in some form or other, in words. So the processes for developing your work, the process of developing ideas and work, the context for your work, the discussion of your creative work linked in to those things above, and then a conclusion that sums up what you've found in your work that you've already developed in that discussion. So those sections 3 to 5 could be in a different order, or they could be blended. So, again, this is up to you in a sense. In music, Annie Mitchell has, Associate Professor Annie Mitchell has a number of proposed structures. And while we're talking in terms of different disciplines here, everyone who's doing an exegesis could be using, thinking through their ideas in relation to any of these. She has an introduction, a methodology section, a literature review, a repertoire analysis, and then analysis of your own creative processes in 2 chapters and creative work, and then a conclusion. In media, there are a range of structures again, but here's one idea. An introduction which outlines the problem, aims and objectives, advantages of using a particular medium, and an outline of the exegesis. A background to the project section and the method. So there's background in terms of content, and then why and how the project was done. Then something around the media product, the process of making, and critical reflections on that, either in relation to audience, participants, or the maker, depending on how your media product has been constructed. And then a discussion and conclusion, reflection on the project aims, did it do what you set out to do, why and why not, how are projects like this important, and what can we learn from this, what's the new knowledge here, what might have been done differently and how. So that's there are already, you can see a range of approaches to this, and that it's a really malleable thing, this idea of an exegesis. Dr. Emma Doolan in creative writing shared with me a number of approaches that she's used to creative writing exegeses. So here, part one is the creative work. Typically the creative work in creative writing comes first. It's intended that to be read before the exegesis. That is, that the reader should be developing their own relationship with the work before you develop their relationship with the work, if you get what I'm saying. And then there's the exegesis, which has the usual stuff of the front matter, title page and so on, the introduction, which outlines the whole exegesis, a literature review, a methodology, a discussion chapter with some textual analysis, some reflection on practice, conclusion and references. And you could imagine then how you might combine that work that Dr. Jim Hearn suggested an exegesis should do with these particular chapters. Another way of doing this might be to blend some of that work or that content. Having done an introduction and a methodology, you might then have a discussion chapter with a literature review, textual analysis and reflective practice interwoven, perhaps in 2 chapters, depending on the window through which you're looking at your creative work. Then finally a conclusion and some references. So at the end of all that, I guess that's material for you to now think about at this stage of the game and your relationship with your research. What type of structure might you have in mind? What might your early ideas for your thesis structure or for your exegesis structure be? And for some of you that may well be given in a sense, that you might be following a traditional pattern, but nevertheless you have to think about what's the content within that. For others, it might be thinking about what is the best structure for the type of work I'm doing, the type of research I'm doing, and generate some ideas for either your thesis or your exegesis, and share these with others. Share it with your supervisor. It's part of the planning process. So last week we talked about things like timelines and managing your research. Another part of it, I guess, there's your timelines and then there's your content. That is, what is it that you're developing through your writing? Okay, that's where I'd like to end it this week with those questions. It's a big one. It's the one that's going to be concerning you throughout much of the rest of your honours year, and so this is early days to start thinking about it, but it's worth thinking about early, just to start thinking about having a vision for where you're going with these final research outputs. Okay, talk to you later. Bye bye.